Hello everyone. Today we're diving into a Wild West love story where a strong-willed white woman and a quiet Apache man are forced to pretend to be married just to save themselves. But when that last starts to feel a little too real, things take a turn no one saw coming. Before we begin this journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you live. It's always amazing to know we've got friends listening from all over the world. And now let's begin the story. The wind rolled down from the Bighorn foothills that morning, dry and sharp enough to sting the eyes. Dust clung to every storefront in Twin Forks, turning the town the color of old parchment. Ruby Holloway stood in the doorway of her bakery, Sweet Hollow, arms folded tight, watching two boys chase a chicken across Main Street, and thinking not for the first time, that this town was made entirely of nonsenses and men with opinions. She'd been up since 4, baking 20 feisty fuss and 24 biscuits. But none of it mattered if the lawman's notice nailed to her door meant what it said. All single proprietors must hold family residency to retain land title under the Territorial Settler Act. In plain words, no husband, no land. Wubby tore the paper down, stuffed it in her apron pocket, and muttered, "Family residency, my foot." She had buried her husband 4 years ago, and had done just fine since. The oven never complained. The accounts balanced, and no one had tracked mud across her clean floors. She didn't need another man, especially not one with dusty boots and the nerve to tell her how to knead dough. That was exactly the kind of man who appeared in front of her store 10 minutes later. He came riding a red horse with a coat the color of rust and eyes to match. His hair hung past his shoulders, black as a thundercloud, tied loosely at the nape. His skin held the sun in an Apache, Ruby guessed, though he wore a plain shirt and boots like any ranch hand. He stopped at her hitching post, swung down, and led the horse to the water trough. Ruby stepped out onto the boardwalk. "That's for customers," she said. "Not every drifter with a thirsty animal." The man looked up at her, calm and unreadable. "Didn't they see a sign? Says, horses got to buy biscuits first." His voice carried that low, steady rhythm of the plains, each word measured. "No hurry to please." Ruby bristled. "Well, now you're seeing one." When she reached for the bucket to dump it, but her foot caught the edge of a flour sack by the door. It tipped, burst open, and a white cloud of flour exploded between them. When the dust settled, her blue dress and his dark shirt were both frosted head to toe. The man blinked once slow. "If you wanted to make me wetter, there are easier ways." Ruby's jaw dropped. "Excuse-me?" He brushed flour from his sleeves. "You've done a fair job already." Then with the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, he added, "Guess we're both half-baked now." Laughter erupted from a few cowhands across the street. Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. You arrogant name's Kana," he said, tightening his saddle strap. "Mean swift." "Not that you asked." "I didn't," she snapped. "Good saves timing." He swung back onto his horse, and before she could think of a retort sharp enough to draw blood, he was already halfway down the street. Ruby stomped back inside, furious, floured, and against her better judgment, just a little intrigued. That afternoon she found herself in the office of Amy R. Jenkins, the town's only lawyer, and by Claire's throat, most accounts, its most talkative man. He leaned back in his chair, chewing the stub of an unlit cigar. "So, let me get this straight," Jenkins said. "The county says if you ain't got a husband by the end of the month, you lose the deed to the bakery." "That's the gist of it," Ruby replied. "And I'm not marrying anyone just to keep a building." "Well, you might not have to marry anyone, strictly speaking." Jenkins rummaged through his desk until he found a folder thick with papers. "Seems you're not the only one in a bind." He slid a form toward her. "This here fella, Quana, something Apache half-breed, runs the forge outside town. He can't get his license renewed without a family sponsor. Territorial rule against unaccompanied Indians." "Don't look at me. I didn't write it." Ruby froze mid-breath. "Kana. Yeah. Know him?" She folded her arms. "We've met briefly." "It's insufferable." "Well," Jenkins said, grinning like a coyote. "Sounds like the start of a beautiful partnership." You two sign a marriage contract, purely business. 6 months, everybody keeps what's theirs. You get your deed. A gets his license. Ruby stared at him. That's absurd, maybe, but it's legal. And given the alternatives, Jenkins tapped the notice on his desk. They say it's cheaper than starting over. She should have walked out. She really should have. But the thought of losing her bakery, the only thing she'd built with her own hands, sat heavy in her chest. What's in this contract? She asked wearily. Oh, the usual. Mutual residence, joint property for 6 months, and I can add a few personal clauses if you like. Keeps things civilized. Half an hour later, the office door opened again and Connor walked in head low, expression unreadable. The sight of him made Ruby's pulse kick, though she refused to admit it. Mr. Jenkins said you had an offer, he said. I have a disaster, Ruby muttered. You're just part of it. Jenkins clapped his hands. Perfect. You two already sound married. Read the terms aloud. 6-month duration, no physical obligations, no public scandal, shared address, equal property rights. Ruby leaned over the page, grabbed the pen, and scribbled an addition. Clause 4, no snoring, no shouting before breakfast, and absolutely no Apache prayers after midnight. Koana took the pen from her, slow and deliberate, and beneath her handwriting added. Clause 5. No throwing objects at husband, real or temporary. Data's met across the paper. 6 months, Ruby said, long enough to regret it, he replied. Jenkins slid the contract toward them, grinning from ear to ear. Sing here, folks. Congratulations. You just made the most romantic business deal in Twin Forks history. Ruby signed with a sharp flick of the wrist. Connor followed, his signature smooth and confident as Jenkins stamped the document. Sander murmured somewhere beyond the hills. Ruby glanced toward the window, half smiling. Guess even the sky doesn't approve. Connor tipped his hat. Or maybe it's laughing already. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain and, Claire's throat, fresh trouble. Neither of them knew it yet, but the storm had already begun. The cabin sat on the edge of the Cottonwood Creek, where the grass grew high, and the wine never stopped moving. It wasn't much one room, a stove, a table, and a narrow bed that looked like it had been built by someone with more muscles than patience. Ruby stopped in the doorway with her hands on her hips, suitcase at her feet, staring as if the place had personally offended her. This is it, she said. Kana already inside dropped a sack of oats beside the stove. Roof don't leak. Floor solid. That's it. It smells like smoke and horse. Bitter than perfume and gossip. Ruby stepped in, dusting her skirt. You could have at least cleaned. It did, he said evenly, hanging his head on a paint yesterday. Then the dirt came back. That's how dirt works. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The man had an answer for everything. There was one bed. One. She glared at it, then at him. Where do you plan to sleep? Kana shrugged. Floor's fine. Ruby had the rough planks. It's freezing at night. A looked up from untying his boots. Didn't say it'd be comfortable. Used fine. Well, I'm not sleeping in a bed knowing a man's on the floor like some stray dog. Good, he said straight-faced. You can take the floor. Ella keep the bed. Hair gas back out of the walls. Excuse me. Clanna didn't blink. You said you didn't want me there. Ruby stared at him, then burst out. You're impossible. A lifted a brow, not according to the county clerk. By sundown, she'd claimed the bed anyway. He laid his blanket on the floor, stretched out beside the stove, and muttered something low in Apache. The rhythm of it filled the room soft, steady, not angry, just ancient. Ruby rolled over, squinting into the dim firelight. What's that supposed to mean? Prayer, he said without opening his eyes. For what? Forgiveness for being infuriating. For paciencia, he said, running low. She huffed and pulled the blanket over her head. I hope you choke on patience. Outside, the coyotes howled. Inside, the two of them lay awake for a long while, pretending they were fine with how the night had turned. Morning and Twin Forks began with the church bell and ended with gossip. By the time Ruby and Connor rode into town together, word had already spread that Mrs. Cece had found herself a husband, and not the usual kind. Ruby could feel eyes on her from every porch. She tightened her bonnet, whispering, "Keep your face pleasant." Connor grunted. "It is pleasant. You look like you're about to arrest somebody." "That's my pleasant." They stopped outside the general store. A few townsfolk gathered nearby, half curious, half scandalized. Ruby forced a bright smile, looped her arm through Connor's, and said loudly, "Morning, darling." She stretched the word like taffy. Connor froze. His eyes widened just a fraction. "Darling," he repeated under his breath. She elbowed him. "Smile." It didn't. Instead, he tipped his hat stiffly at the gawkers and said, "MRS, Trouble and I are fine, thank you." "MRS, Trouble," she hissed. The crowd chuckled. One man clapped Connor on the back. "You got yourself a lively one, friend." Ruby's smile didn't falter, but her whisper carried heat. "You really enjoying this?" "Not yet," he said. "But I will." By noon, they'd returned to the cabin, and Ruby was still filling. She threw her bonnet onto the table. "You made me look ridiculous." Connor leaned in the doorway, arms folded. "You made yourself ridiculous." He just gave it a name. "MRS, Trouble," she mimicked bitterly. "You think you're funny?" Ish shrugged. "Down does." She grabbed a broom and began sweeping furiously. "If we're going to live here 6 months, we need rules. I thought that's what the contract was for. These are house rules." She jabbed the broom toward him. "No smoking, no muddy boots inside. And no brooding silence before breakfast." "It's unnerving." He stepped closer. "You don't like silence?" "I don't like your silence. It feels judgmental." "Maybe it is." Ruby's mouth dropped open, then snapped shut again. "You." She swatted the broom at his boots. "Out." He stepped aside easily, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "You're going to make a fine wife. I'm going to make a murderer if you don't move." Later that week, Mr. Jenkins came by to check that the happy couple was complying with all terms. He was met by Ruby with flour on her face and Connor holding a skillet like a shield. "Well," Jenkins said, smiling. "Looks, Cody." "Perfectly fine," Ruby said through clenched teeth. Connor nodded solemnly. "She hasn't killed me yet." "Give it time," Ruby muttered. Jenkins chuckled and handed over an envelope. "Official letter from the county. They'll want proof of residence and community involvement. You'll need to show up at Sunday service together. Hand in hand, preferably Spain." Ruby blinked. "Church public display of harmony." Jenkins said, "You know, till death do you paperwork." After the lawyer left, Ruby turned to Connor. "You ever been to church?" "Once," he said. "Didn't end well." "What happened?" "Preacher called me a heathen." He agreed. Ruby sighed. "Well, you'll just have to keep quiet and look sanely." "I don't know how to look sanely." "Then look married," she said. "Half the town already thinks that's the same thing." Sunday came bright and cold. Ruby wore a blue dress. Connor wore a clean shirt and the expression of a man heading to his own execution. As they entered the small clapboard church, every head turned. The preacher's smile tightened. Ruby laced her fingers through Connor's arm and whispered, "Smile. Remember the contract." He murmured back, "Remember the clause about not throwing things." She pinched his arm hard. The preacher launched into a sermon about unity between neighbors. Ruby sat stiff as a fence post. Connor, to her surprise, didn't move or fidget. He simply watched the sunlight fall through the window, a faint calm in his face. For a moment, she saw not a stranger, but a man who carried storms quietly. Then he leaned toward her and whispered, "If I survive this, you're baking me a pie." She blinked. "What?" "Every good husband deserves pie." She nearly laughed but the preacher cleared his throat and she bit it back. When they returned home that evening, the tension had shifted. Ruby made stew. Kana fixed the door hinge. They still bickered over salt. Viejo used the last of the soap, but the words came softer, the edges less sharp. As dusk fell, Ruby stepped outside. The air smelled of sage and woodsome smoke. Inside, Kana sat by the stove, mending a bridle strap with careful hands. He looked up briefly, met her gaze, and said, "You did good today." "Good what?" "Pretending," he said. "Don't believe it." Ruby leaned against the door frame. "Did you?" He studied her for a moment, then returned to his work. "Don't know yet." She didn't press him. The coyotes began their nightly song across the creek. And somewhere in the dark, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter, two people learning, awkwardly and unwillingly what it meant to share a laugh. And though neither would admit it, the cabin already felt less like a compromise, and more like the start of something dangerous and possibly sweet. By late May, the cottonwoods along the creek had turned silver green, and Twin Forks had grown used to the sight of Ruby Holloway and Kohanadin walking side by side down Main Street. At least Ruby hoped they had. Every time she caught someone watching them, she'd force a smile so wide her cheeks hurt, link her arm through his, and chirp, "Lovely day, isn't it, darling," in a voice 2 octaves too high. And every time Kana would nod like a condemned man accepting his fate. "Lovely," he'd echo, flat as an anvil. It was exhausting, keeping up the act, and worse. Sometimes it didn't feel like an act at all. One bright morning, Mr. Jenkins showed up at the bakery with ink-stained fingers and his usual grin. "Big news, Lawbeards. The county clerk's requesting a photograph for the records. Proof of your domestic bliss." Ruby froze mid-stir, though clinging to her wrist. A photograph indeed. Tomorrow, dress nice, smile natural. It'll be framed on the courthouse wall for all to admire. Kana, leaning in the doorway, muttered, "Natural? That rolls us out." Ruby threw a pinch of flour at him. "We'll manage somehow." The photographer's studio smelled like lamp oil and nervous sweat. Ruby wore her best gingham dress, hair pinned up in curls that refused to behave. Kana stood beside her, scrubbed clean, his dark hair tied back neat. Though he looked about as comfortable as a coyote in church. "Closer, folks," the photographer instructed, peering from under a black cloth. Ruby inched toward him, but Kana stayed stiff. "Closer," the man repeated. "Pretend you like each other." Ruby hissed under her breath. "You could at least look like you enjoy this." He muttered back. "You could at least stop stepping on my boot." "I'm not." "Oh, for heaven's sake, smile." "I am smiling," he said without moving a single muscle. Ruby's hand shot out and pinched the back of his arm. Kana jerked slightly, then let out a low grunt. Half pain, half laughter. The camera clicked. "Perfect," the photographer announced. "You two look like a couple right out of a storybook." Ruby blinked. Kana's shoulder was shaking quiet laughter under his breath. "That hurt," he murmured. "Good," she said. "Maybe it'll remind you to look human next time." That afternoon, back at the cabin, Ruby decided she would repay him for every smirk and teasing word. She announced she was teaching him how to bake. Kana's face went carefully blank. "Why?" "So you can feed yourself once we divorce." He folded his arms. "He can cook just fine. Metal doesn't count." 10 minutes later, he was standing in her kitchen with flour on his forearms and a look of pure suspicion. Ruby handed him a rolling pin. "Roll it out gently." He pressed down. The dough stuck. He tried again harder. "It's not an enemy, Kana," he grunted, lifting the pin. The dough tore clean in half. "Seems I won," Ruby groaned. "You're impossible. And yet you keep talking to me." When the first batch of biscuits came out of the oven, they were as black as coal. The smell drifted all the way to the creek. Kana looked at the smoking pan and nodded once. "You made choco." "He made breakfast." Ruby snapped. "For who?" "The devil." She picked up a biscuit and hurled it at his chest. It bounced off harmlessly. It bent down, picked it up, and took a bite. She gaped. "You're eating it." It chewed thoughtfully. "Could you salt?" Ruby tried not to laugh, but it bubbled out anyway, helpless and worn. She doubled over, clutching her apron. While Kana watched her, half-speed eating in spite of himself. "Guess that counts as your first real smile," she said finally. He tilted his head. "And your first good meal." By late afternoon, they were outside, airing out the cabin and sweeping the porch. The scent of scorched dough still lingered. Kana was mending the fence when Ruby brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat on the steps. "Don't suppose you've ever had neighbors before," she said. "Not the kind who talk this much." She sipped, hiding her grin. "You're lucky I'm still talking to you after what you did to my biscuits." "You did that," he corrected. "Damn effort," she replied. He paused his hammering. "You really hate losing, don't you?" "I don't lose, I adapt." "Same thing," he said. She threw him a glare over her shoulder. "Careful. You're adapting to a broom handle across the head." He only smiled that small crooked smile that drove her half mad. That evening, rain came sudden and hard, drumming on the roof like hooves. The fire crackled inside, throwing gold light on the walls. Ruby sat at the table, writing in the ledger, while Kahana patched a saddle strap near the stove. The room smelled of coffee, damp leather, and wood smoke. After a long stretch of quiet, Ruby said softly, "Why did you leave your tribe?" He didn't look up. "Didn't they leave, just stopped belonging?" She waited, but he didn't offer more. She nodded slowly, closing her book. "You know the feeling." He glanced at her then, eyes catching the firelight. "You left your people, though." "They left me," she said simply. "After my husband died, everyone stopped calling. I suppose grief isn't good company." He studied her for a moment. "You beg for half the town." "It's business." "No," he said quietly. "It's remembering." Ruby met his gaze and felt something shift inside her. Something small but certain. She looked away quickly. "You talk too much for a quiet man. And you're quiet for someone who talks so much." She threw a crumpled napkin at him. He caught it midair, grinning. The next day, Twin Forks hosted its annual Founders' Picnic, a noisy affair of pies, music, and far too many curious neighbors. Ruby and Kana were coaxed well, cornered into entering the best couple cook-off. Ruby wanted to refuse. Kana just raised a brow. "Afraid I'll burn less than you." "Afraid I'll strangle you with the apron string," she replied, tying it around her waist. The contest turned into chaos. Kana tried to follow her directions, but mixed salt for sugar. Ruby shouted. He laughed. The batter exploded. When the smoke cleared, they stood covered in batter, the oven door hanging open. The crowd burst into laughter. Ruby wanted to sink through the floor, but Kana wiped a streak of dough from her cheek and said, clear enough for everyone to hear. "Guess love's not neat work." The laughter softened into applause. Ruby stared at him, stunned. For the first time, she couldn't tell if he was acting or not. That night, back at the cabin, she was still thinking about it. Kana sat outside mending the wagon harness. Fireflies blinked near the grass. She stepped out quietly. "About today," she began. He looked up, waiting. "You didn't have to say that about love." "Didn't they say it was ours?" he replied easily. Her stomach fluttered with something she refused to name. "Then why'd you say it?" He meant her eyes. "Because everyone believed it." She folded her arms. "Including you?" He hesitated just long enough for the truth to flicker across his face. "Maybe," he said. Ruby turned away, pretending to watch the creek, though her pulse raced. Inside the cabin, the photograph they'd taken that morning rested on the shelf, her hand on his arm. Both of them caught mid-laugh. The light had turned their faces softer, closer, almost tender. It looked real. And maybe, just maybe, it was starting to be. By mid-June, the air over Twin Forks shimmered like a mirage. Aat pressed down from the sky, heavy as guilt. The Cottonwood Creek had shrunk to a trickle, and Temper's rubies especially dried up right along with it. The bakery had been busy that morning, filled with gossip. The gossip disguised as customers. Women leaned over the counter with sticky coins and sweeter smiles, their eyes bright with questions. So, one asked, tracing a finger across a pie tin. How's married life, Mrs. Dean? Ruby forced a grin, louder than I'd like, but steady as an oven. They tittered and left, whispering before the door even shut. She slammed the register closed, muttering, if one more of person asks me about our love story, I'll start charging admission. That was the moment the door creaked open again, and in walked a man she didn't recognize. Tall, pale, trim beard, hat too clean for a rancher. He looked around like he was measuring the air. Mrs. Ruby Dean. That's me, she said cautiously. He smiled thinly. Coulter, territorial land inspector here on official business. The words land inspector made her blood run cold. We already passed inspection months ago indeed, he set a leather folder on the counter and flipped it open. Used routine follow-up. Nothing personal. His finger tapped a copy of their marriage contract. Ruby's stomach flipped. Close cuatro. He read aloud. No snoring, no shouting before breakfast, and absolutely no Apache prayers after midnight. His eyebrow arched. Unusual terms for a legal union. Ruby straightened her apron. We have a sense of humor. Humor, he repeated, writing something in his notebook. The law doesn't laugh much, ma'am. She bristled. Are you implying something? He closed the folder gently, as if afraid the paper might bite. Not yet. That night, she told Kana everything as he worked by the forge. Sparks flew into the dark like angry stars. He showed me the contract, she said. Close cuatro. The man practically smirked when he read it. Kana didn't look up. Then don't smirk back. Ella get bored. It's not the type to get bored. It's the type to dig now. We looked at her steady, calm, maddeningly so. Let him dig. There is nothing to find. Ruby threw up her hands. Do you think this is nothing? Ella talked to people. People who notice things. Like what? Her voice cracked. Like the fact that we don't even share a bed. That made him pause. Amir mid-swing. Do you want to fix that? Ruby glared. Don't you dare joke right now. He shrugged, half a smile hiding at the edge of his mouth. Cold have fooled me. The next morning, the fooling was over. Amir Coulter had wasted no time. He paid a visit to the general store, to the church, and to anyone who'd ever nodded at Ruby or Kana in passing. By sunset, half the town had heard the whispers. They sleep in separate rooms. She called him her business partner. She only married him to keep her land. By the second day, it wasn't whispers anymore. It was talk loud enough to follow Ruby down the street. When she arrived at the bakery, a notice nailed to the door stopped her cold. Property sealed, pending investigation. The stamp of the territorial office bled red in the morning light. Her hands trembled as she tore it down. Inside, flour dust hung in the air like a ghost. A moment later, Connor rode up from the forge, jaw tight. They pulled my permit, said my application was under review. Ruby turned on him. What did you tell them? Nothing. You had to have said something. He said nothing. Then how did they know? He dismounted, facing her squarely, because someone couldn't stop talking at the market. Maybe her eyes widened. Do you think I did this? You're the one who tells half the town when the bread rises and when it falls. Oh, that's rich coming from the man who answers every question with a riddle. Kana's mouth twitched, anger flickering beneath the calm. At least my riddles don't come with receipts. Her cheeks flushed red. Do you think you're better than me because you talk less? Let me tell you something, Mr. Dean. You can go a whole lifetime silent and still be wrong. His jaw clenched and you can talk all day and still not say a damn thing that matters. The silence after that hit harder than any slap. Then Ruby voice shaking said, you know what? He should have married a mule. At least it would listen. Kana stared at her for half a heartbeat, then said evenly, "Go ahead. Mules don't snore." She threw a dish rag at his chest. "You don't," he said softly. "Not unless you mean it." The rag fell to the floor between them. The forge hissed somewhere behind him, the bakery oven cooling behind her. She swallowed hard. "Fine, fine," he echoed. By dusk, she'd packed her things ashore, a ledger, and the silver ring he'd given her for show. She left it on the table. The house looked bigger without her voice filling it. Kana watched from the porch as she saddled her mare. "Do ella stay in town?" he asked quietly. She didn't look at him. "Don't worry. Wouldn't they want to ruin your fine reputation?" He almost smiled. "Beat late for that." She swung into the saddle, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. "Goodbye, Kana. Goodbye, Mrs. Trouble." Her throat tightened, but she kicked the horse forward before the tears could start. For 3 days, the house by the creek stood empty, except for the fork's fading coals. Kana worked until his hands blistered, then stopped working altogether. The silence pressed down like the heat. In town, Ruby took a room above the general store. Every morning she walked past her shuttered bakery and pretended she didn't see the sign still nailed to the door. On the 4th evening she heard voices through the open window, 2 farmers passing by there, seeing the DUI woman skipping town. "Can't blame," Claire's throat, hair. "That inspector will have them both run out before week's end." Ruby closed the window and sank onto the bed, heart pounding. For the first time since she'd met him. The idea of never seeing Kana again scared her more than any law or gossip. At the same hour, Kana stood by the river, the sky burning orange over the hills. He held the old contract in his hand. The paper creased and smudged, his thumb brushed over her name. "You said 6 months," he murmured. "Guess I should have asked for forever." The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of the paper. He let it go. The contract fluttered downriver, spinning like a leaf until it vanished into the current. When the last scrap disappeared, he turned toward town, the decision already made in the set of his jaw. If she was leaving, she'd hear the truth before she went. But he didn't know that Ruby that same night was saddling her mare again because somewhere deep down between pride and regret she'd decided she wasn't done either. 2 stubborn hearts both heading for the same truth just from opposite directions. And before dawn broke over Twin Forks, they'd find out that no lie, no matter how clever, how convenient, could outlast the sound of 2 people who'd stopped pretending to hate each other. The morning of the formal hearing dawned clear and sharp, the kind of Wyoming day, when the sky looked too big for its own good. Wind came off the hills, smelling of sage and wet earth. Ruby rode into town beside Kana in silence. Her fingers tied around the rest. Her stomach knotted tighter still. Twin Forks was awake early. Every porch had someone leaning on it. Every window held a pair of eyes pretending not to stare. The story of the fake marriage had spread like prairie fire. Some whispered that Ruby had seduced an Apache to steal land. Others swore Kana had tricked her for citizenship. The truth didn't seem to matter much to any was except the 2 people living it. When they reached the courthouse, Mr. Jenkins was waiting out front, hat, Claire's throat, tilted against the sun, cigar stub hanging from his lips. "Morning, sweethearts," he greeted. "You ready to charm the pants off the law?" Ruby gave him a look. "Do you realize I could be arrested for fraud?" Jenkins shrugged. "Only if they can prove you weren't in love." Kana dismounted, tying the horse. "They can't prove what's not written down." Ruby muttered. "They have an easier time proving I'm going to faint." Inside the courthouse smelled of Keith's dust and paper. The benches creaked with townsfolk who had come to witness the spectacle, neighbors, gossip mongers, half the choir from church. The air buzzed with expectation. At the front sat Mr. Coulter, the land inspector, pale and smug in his beige coat, the territorial judge beside him, bald and sleepy-eyed. When Ruby and Kana entered, a hush rippled through the room. The judge cleared his throat. "This hearing concerns the fraudulent marriage contract between Ruby Holloway and Kana Dean. Mr. Coulter, you may present your case." Coulter rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the evidence is simple. The defendants entered into a false union solely to exploit land-grant privileges. Their own contract contains non-marital clauses, no snoring, no physical obligations that mock the sanctity of marriage. They deceive this county and must be held accountable. Whispers swirled like wind through dry grass. Ruby wanted to sink through the floor. She risked a glance at Kana. He sat steady, arms crossed, gaze fixed straight ahead. Coulter continued, voice dripping with satisfaction. I call as witnesses several townsfolk who observed the defendants sleeping in separate quarters. And enough, Ruby snapped before she could stop herself. Baby, I turned to her. Jube spent 2 weeks spying on my home, digging through my private papers, and dragging my name through mud. Do you call that justice? The judge frowned. Mrs. Ajobai, please contain yourself. She bit her lip, her cheeks burning, and sat down hard. Coulter smirked. No further comments, Your Honor. The record speaks for itself. The judge turned to Kana. Mr. Dean, you may respond. For a long moment, Kana didn't move. Then he stood tall and unhurried like a man preparing to shoe a nervous horse. His voice was low, but carried to every corner of the room. We did marry for land, he said simply. That part's true. We both needed something the law said we couldn't have alone. He needed a forged permit. She needed a deed. So, we made a bargain. Coulter leaned back at his feet. Finally, some honesty. Kana's gaze swung to him. I'm not done. The room stilled again. He thought it would be easy, Kana went on. 6 months, no trouble. But turns out lying's a full-time job. She cooked. He built the fire. We talked less than a prayer and, Claire's throat, fought more than thunder. Then one day, I realized I wasn't pretending to care whether she wanted it or not. He just did. He turned toward Ruby. That's when I broke the contract. The words hit her chest like a blow, soft, sure, and entirely unexpected. Kana continued, you want the truth? The law forced us to lie. It made a woman's worth measured by a man beside her and an Indian's worth measured by who owned him. We bent the rule because it was already crooked. A murmur rose through the crowd, some disbelieving, some thoughtful. Coulter sputtered, this is a confession, not a sermon. Maybe, Kana said. But you wanted truth. Now you have it. He faced the judge again. Punish us if you need to. Take the land. Take the forge. But don't tell me it wasn't real. Not after everything she taught me. The judge blinked slowly. His pen paused above the ledger. Told you what, son? Kana's voice softened. That home isn't a place. It's the person who waits for you there. A silence spread deep and thick. Ruby sat frozen, heart pounding like a runaway horse. She wanted to speak, but her throat felt too tight. Then the judge nodded to her. Mrs. Ajobai, your turn. She stood shakily. Everything he said is true, she began. Except one thing. Kana looked up startled. She smiled faintly. He said I taught him something. Truth is, he taught me, though. He taught me that peace isn't quiet. Peace is someone who listens when you shout. A ripple of laughter moved through the benches. Ruby swallowed hard. He won't pretend we started this the right way. But I'll be damned if I let anyone say we didn't end it honest. The judge leaned back, rubbing his temples. Well, this is highly irregular. Mr. Jenkins stood from the back of the room. If I might, Your Honor, the judge sighed. Make it quick, Jenkins. Used an observation, Jenkins said, voice sly but kind. Every day this town pardons men who steal cattle, cheat cards, or forget their taxes. Seems to me these two only stole each other. Maybe we can forgive that. The crowd chuckled softly. Even the judge cracked a weary smile. After a long pause, he rapped the gavel once. The court finds insufficient evidence of fraud. Territorial marriage rights revoked, property to be reissued individually. Case dismissed. He looked over his spectacles at Ruby and Kana. You're free to go, though I'd advise you to decide what you want before the county clerk does it for you. The room erupted into murmurs as Colto spluttered in protest, but Ruby barely heard him. Kana reached for her hand as they stepped out into the sunlight. Outside, the day had turned gold and warm. The crowd spilled from the courthouse, voices buzzing. Some nodded at them now, awkward but friendly. Others kept their distance. It didn't matter. Ruby looked at Kana. You realize you just confessed in front of half the county? In nodded. Easiest thing I ever said. You risked everything. So did you. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ruby laughed, soft and shaky. We requite the scandal. Ismail. Best kind. True when. They walked toward the hitching post. The horses snorted, impatient to go home. Ruby stopped, turning to face him fully. He never said thank you, she said. For what? For not letting them tell our story for us. Kana studied her a long moment, the sunlight glinting off the scar above his eyebrow. Guess we'll have to write the next part. She tilted her head. You planning to stay? He brushed his thumb over her hand. Depends. You planning to throw me out? She hesitated just long enough for a grin to form on his face. Maybe after breakfast, she said. He laughed quiet and deep, and for the first time since they'd signed that cursed contract. The sound felt easy. They rode home in the fading light. The prairie spread wide and endless, the grass whispering secrets to the wind. When they reached the cabin, Ruby dismounted first. The door creaked open to the familiar smell of bread and iron. She turned to him standing in the doorway. Well, she said, I suppose this means we're divorced. Kana looked past her into the cabin, the small table, the crooked chair, the single bed that somehow always felt big enough. If you say so. Technically, she teased, not married anymore. He stepped closer until their shoulders brushed. Technically, he murmured. That's a shame, her pulse skipped. What are you suggesting, Mr. Dean? That we try it again, he said. No papers, no rules, no clauses about snoring. Ruby smiled slow and sure. You planning to break that one already? He leaned in, his breath warm. Probably. The wind pushed through the open window, fluttering the old contract pinned above the hearth. One corner of it had torn loose, and the inked words, no pretending, danced in the draft. Ruby reached up and pressed it flat again, her hand resting over the faded signature. Then she turned back to Kana, eyes bright. All right, she said. Let's see what a real marriage looks like. Outside of the ski stretched endless and blue, and the prairie wind carried their laughter far down the valley, two people who had led their way into the truth, and found that against all odds, it fit them perfectly. By the time August rolled across the plains, Twin Forks had almost forgotten the scandal. The talk of that sham marriage had cooled into the kind of gossip folks only whispered over pa. Out by the Cottonwood Creek, life had settled into a rhythm again, quieter, slower, and for Ruby and Kana, oddly peaceful. The cabin still leaned a little to one side. The roof still groaned in the wind, but the space between them had changed. There was laughter in it now, and the sort of ease that can't be written into any contract. Most mornings began the same way. We'd be meeting dough by the open window. Kana hammering at the forge beside the porch. The air filled with the twin rhythms of work, the soft thud of dough against the counter, the ring of iron meeting steel. On one of those mornings, Ruby set a tray of cinnamon rolls to cool and stepped outside. Kana was bent over the anvil, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. She stood watching him for a while, then called, You know, for someone who nearly lost everything, you look awful pleased with yourself. He glanced up, squinting through the sunlight. I'm still here, ain't I? Barely, she said, Esmirkin. You swing that hammer like you are trying to kill the past. He wiped his forehead, smiled faintly. Maybe I am. She folded her arms. If you hit any harder, you'll scare the horses. Not your horses, he said, and pointed with his chin toward the field, where her new sign stood, a simple wooden board hung from two chains. Sweet Hollow Bakery and Forge. Honest work, honest people. Ruby couldn't help but grin. Do you like it? Feels right, he said. Looks like both of us. That evening, the townsfolk gathered for the harvest fair, the first since the scandal. Stalls lined Main Street, lanterns swinging in the breeze, fiddles singing somewhere near the saloon. Ruby hadn't planned on going. She told herself she was too busy, too tired, too uninterested. But when Kana appeared at the door wearing his clean shirt and that crooked half-smile, she found herself tying her hair with a ribbon and pretending it was no big thing. They walked in together and conversation rippled through the crowd like wind over wheat. Some faces smiled, others turned away. Ruby lifted her chin higher. Think they're still talking, she whispered. Probably, Kana said. But if they've got to talk about someone, might as well be us. And they wandered past rows of pies and preserves, children running between them. The town's brass band struck up a lopsided tune. Someone called out, "Hey there, MRS, Dean. Back from the courthouse alive, we'll be stopped short." Kana didn't. He simply tipped his hat and said, "More or less." The man laughed, clapping him on the back. Ruby exhaled. For the first time, she realized the teasing wasn't cruel anymore. It was ordinary, familiar. When the dancing began, the fiddles quickened, and the night took on a glow that felt almost magical. Kana stood at the edge of the circle, watching the couple spin. Ruby elbowed him lightly. "You planning to stand there or dance like everyone else?" "I don't sense," he said. "Neither do I, that's why it'll be fair." Before he could prod, she caught his hand and pulled him into the circle. The crowd whooped. Someone shouted, "About time." At first, it was a disaster. Kana moved with the cautious stiffness of a man defusing dynamite. Ruby stepped on his boot twice, laughed, and tried again. But after a few turns, their steps found the same rhythm, the same steady beat they'd built together without knowing it. When the song ended, Ruby was breathless and laughing against his shoulder. Kana's hand lingered at her waist, warm and certain. Clear's throat, she looked up at him, teasing. "You sure you don't dance?" "Ismail. Didn't say I couldn't. Used said I didn't." But the next morning, sunlight spilled through the window like honey. Ruby sat at the table, pen scratching across the pages of the old ledger where she tracked orders and ingredients. Kana entered quietly, holding something wrapped in cloth. He laid it on the table, "Found this in the shed." She unwrapped it, the old contract, the one they had signed months ago. Ages curled, ink faded. She stared at it a moment, then burst out laughing. "Good Lord, I forgot this even existed." Kana's mouth curved, "Thought we might keep it." Ruby looked up as a reminder of what not to do. As a reminder of what worked, he said softly. He reached for a charcoal pencil, tore off the bottom edge, and wrote a single new line beneath their old signatures. Close 60. No more pretending. He handed her the pencil. "You sign, to." She hesitated, heart fluttering the way it had that day in the lawyer's office. But this time, there was no fear, no trick, no bargain. Only choice. She bent and signed her name beneath his. When she straightened, he was watching her the way he always did when he was about to say something important. Steady, careful, like words mattered. "Ruby," he said quietly. "You know, I can't offer much. No big house, no fine china. Used this place, just me." She smiled. "I've already seen your worst, Kana. It's a fair trade." He laughed softly. "Then I suppose this makes us official." "Finally," she said, "and this time, no refunds." A week later, the bakery opened its doors again. New paint, new sign, same smell of sugar and wood smoke. People came curious at first, then hungry, then happy. Kohana's forge clanged steady in the back, and the scent of iron mixed with cinnamon in a way that somehow worked. One afternoon, a group of travelers stopped by. A woman admired the braided ring Ruby wore on a chain around her neck. "Beautiful piece," she said. "Your husband make that?" Ruby glanced toward the forge where Kana was bent over a horseshoe, sunlight flashing off his hair. She smiled. "Edith. Looks like it's holding strong," the woman said. Ruby touched the ring lightly. "So are we." That night they sat on the porch, the sun melting into the horizon. The prairie shimmered gold and endless. A soft wind stirred the cottonwoods carrying the smell of baked bread and warm iron. Ruby leaned against his shoulder. "Do you ever think we were just lucky?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe we worked for it." "Worked for love." "For peace," he answered. "Love came as part of the bargain." She laughed quietly. "That's the best deal I've ever made." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. She recognized the top as the rest of their old contract torn from the piece they'd kept. "That's that?" He unfolded it, revealing a single sentence written in his careful hand. "This is our home." He handed it to her, thought it deserved its own class. Ruby blinked back a sudden sting of tears. "You and your contracts," she murmured. "Can smile. Keeps me honest." She leaned up and kissed him, slow and sure, the sky deepening above them to the color of twilight iron. When they finally pulled apart, the prairie was quiet, the first stars flickering awake. Somewhere nearby, the forge's coals glowed faintly through the open door, steady as a heartbeat. Ruby took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "No more pretending," she said softly. He squeezed back. "No more pretending," he echoed. The wind swept through the valley then, warm and low, carrying their laughter and the smell of bread far into the dark. Two voices, two hearts, and one honest laugh under a ski big enough to hold it all. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of today's story. If you enjoy romantic and funny tales set in the Old West, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think. I always love hearing from you. See you in the next story where love always finds its way home.